Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Sekani Solomon. I'm a senior motion designer based out of New York, and I want to give Maxon a big shout out for allowing me to present to you guys today. I have a really exciting presentation ready for you guys. I know you're going to enjoy it. But before I jump into my presentation, I want to start you guys off with my brand spanking new 2020 demo reel. Here it is. So for my presentation today, I'm going to be showing you guys my brand new film, Star Wars The Last Stand. As of right now, I think it has 2.8 million views. This is something I released a couple months ago. It's something I'm super excited about, and I can't wait to really break it down and show you guys the process of making the film. So before I jump into my presentation, I obviously need to show you. So without further ado, here's the film. So that was my film, Star Wars The Last Stand. And for this presentation, we're really going to be taking an in-depth look into the development process of this film. And I really think it's important to do that just because when you're creating short projects like this one, process is key to making the final result, especially because there's so much time in production. So we're really going to be looking at the process and how Cinema 4D helped us to create this film using that process. So the reason I really want to emphasize process and planning is because sometimes as animators and 3D artists, we just kind of jump into production without necessarily figuring out what we want to do. We're just so eager to make something that we don't really kind of take the time to plan what we're making. So especially with a film like this that's so technically involved, planning was super duper important. So this all started off as a gag. The initial idea was a joke, right? So in late 2016, the IT lead, Alex Jones at the time, when I was at Imaginary Forces, we kind of hatched this plan. I can't even remember how it came about, but we decided to make like this 10-second animation of him in a Jedi outfit for laughs and, kicks. So, I started laying out the idea, but I am not the best artist. So usually what I do, I just jump into cinema right away. And what's great about cinema is that I could get compositions and angles that are pretty accurate to what can be represented in the final film. Versus like if I sketched it, what I sketched might not actually work when I go into the software. So jumping into cinema, and just doing rough things, nothing too detailed, to figure out what I'm doing is always essential in my process. So again, the initial idea is just Jedi facing off against stormtroopers. So this is me. I'm using Octane. I just kind of laid out a couple compositions, just seeing what looks cool. How can I create a narrative with these pieces? And I usually start off with just a really general idea of what I'm trying to do. But, I just kind of mess around with a bunch of compositions and see how I could all stitch it together. So I think I had this idea of like these stormtroopers shooting against this one Jedi, and he uses his force powers and then blows them away. And then more comes in, and it's like this final fight between the Jedi and these stormtroopers. And like I had this idea of like starting off with this stormtrooper on the floor, and that's something that made it into the final film. And again, this is just using the Redshift Alpha, laying out some compositions. Really just trying to get a narrative and a story. Cool. So at some point, that initial idea fell through. I think I had left Imaginary Forces, and then my other short film, Hidden, had come to light. And I was thinking, okay, well, how could I turn this into like a real cool project? And also, like, how would I make it different from other Star Wars projects? Because if you jump on YouTube right now, you'll literally see 50,000 Star Wars projects. So a couple things came to mind. What if it was from the perspective of a stormtrooper? That would be pretty dope. POV. I also really wanted it to feel like one continuous shot for as long as possible. So I tried to make as little cuts as possible. Have the lighting be dynamic, have the camera angles be really cool, but also really focusing on the small moments of the fight. Like, what are the things that we haven't seen before, whether it be the internal HUD of a stormtrooper or the inside of a weapon of a stormtrooper? Like, what are those things? What are those moments? What are they feeling throughout this fight? Also, another thing I wanted to do was add like really nice, cool effects. But if it's one trend I'm kind of realizing in motion design is we kind of get a lot of effects without, a meaning behind it. And in some ways, I think that could take away from the design. So when I was planning like big explosion shots or laser shots, I was really keeping in mind and asking myself, how is this going to add to the story? So also for me, I was going through uncharted territory, right? At that point, I was texturing on a higher. I hadn't textured anything like this realistically. This was before Hidden when I kind of started this process. I'm terrible at rigging. I'm not a character animator, and explosions and fire effects. These are stuff like I barely had touched. So I know for this project in particular, it was going to be an uphill battle. So I knew I needed help, right? And I also needed to do research. So unlike my past from Hidden, which, is something I planned and completed myself, it was important for me to do as much as possible myself, but also do it in a way where if I asked for help, it would require as less heavy lifting from people that would be helping me. Just because I know everyone's busy and I didn't have a budget, and I needed to not take a lot of their time to get stuff done. But also I wanted to hunt for the right references and the right images to really kind of dictate what I was going to do until people I was working with, this is the direction that we should take. So then they're not guessing, and it just makes the process for them as easy as possible. So when it came to the environment, like I needed to find the right mood and the right pieces. I wanted it to be sci-fi-ish, but like getting this combination of being like minimalist. So like having more so like the textures shine and having some lines somewhere, but not making it like overly complicated, like this reference, for instance. Also, like, how am I going to show these stormtroopers? So I got a lot of reference. This isn't representative of all the reference that I acquired, but I really needed to find out like how each of these stormtroopers are going to pose or look, how the lighting is going to be, how dirty or grungy or battle torn these stormtroopers are going to look, because again, it was essential to make this feel like gritty and different. Also, I know I wanted like a exploding, shattering moment, right? And trying to figure out how that was going to look like was important to me, just because I love breaking things with Cinema 4D and shattering using Voronoi and MoGraph. They're all super duper fun to do, which we'll be discussing later. So yeah, I had to do research to figure out how I wanted those things to look like. Also, the inside of the blaster for me, I think, was an interesting opportunity to do something different. And knowing that blasters aren't necessarily powered by kyber crystals, it's my film, so you know what? Let me just break a little bit of lore. I really took a reference from the internal workings of a lightsaber, and I got a cross section. I was like, oh wow, it's powered by a crystal. This is kind of, this is really cool. How would it be like if the inside of a stormtrooper weapon looked like this? So I really kind of used some of this reference to reinforce that imagery. Also the lighting, right? The lighting had to feel good, feel dynamic, feel really nice and engaging. So, I definitely pulled references for that. So at this point, again, this is like the really early stages. I hadn't really done a bunch of like really cool texture work. I didn't have knowledge of curvature maps and stuff. So I jumped into Marvelous Painter, right? And when I discovered those tools, I was like, my goodness, this is super duper cool. Just the idea of like getting wear and tear on the edges, I was like, wow, this is super dope. So these were like some of the very initial texturing tests I did, and clearly I was so excited I just overdid everything with stuff on the edges. So then on to the environment. I did a really initial sketch, not great because my drawing skills are very meh. But this is how the final environment turned out, just based on the references again, like that combination of being a little bit minimalist and having the textures shine through, again, just so it doesn't take away too much from the action. So then these were the initial style frames I created, starting off with that shot, Stormtrooper on the ground, some cool firing shots, making sure the texture and everything looks really nice. And of course that last shot. So the second round of frames I did, and this is interesting, right? Because those first round of frames I created in 2016, and that's really when I was like, yeah, time to do hidden. So I did hidden, and I took maybe like a 2-year break, and I picked up Star Wars again, I think, in late 2018. So again, trying to dial in those things. And for me, it's always essential to create style frames before you go into production. Because again, like I think I've mentioned before in another presentation, it's like your roadmap. So this was the inside of the blaster that I created. This was that impact shot. This was like one of the key moments. I was super happy when I got this one designed because I I was trying to figure out how it was going to look like, but I thought, this turned out pretty cool. There it is again, and this is that large explosion shot, landing shot. So at this point, I was like, okay, cool. I have some cool dynamic angles. How, is this stuff going to look like? So one thing I really love about cinema, which I expressed, is, again, the ability to just jump in and make stuff. So when we're fleshing out cameras, I have my scenes, and I could just come in and start doing a really quick play blast, experiment with different movements. Just kind of test to see what works, what doesn't, how are these shots going to connect, how are we planning all this stuff. And, I went through like several iterations of like this end shot, how this camera is going to go, how are we going to look at all these stormtroopers, just kind of had to work through that process. So this is early, super duper early animatic that I created. But again, doing it like this is really essential to getting a feel of if what you planned is going to work. And the great thing about using Redshift as well is that it renders so quick if you just do like the progressive mode, that you can get a really nice test of like how these things can potentially look, to see if like the lighting and shaders look good with some motion blur and depth of field. And it really begins to inform decisions you can make when going through that process. So I think at this point, I'm a little bit further along with planning the shots. And now I'm like getting to a place where I feel like I can really begin to dial in all those nuanced things that make this film feel like the film. So one of the things I knew that would be paramount is that very first shot, right, where we saw that interface. So I was so swamped with things to do on the project, and I know there are other people that can design these interfaces better than I can. So I tapped my buddy Toros Kos, who is an amazing designer, to help me out with the design of the interface, and he did a phenomenal job. So just a quick tip, I know a lot of you probably know this, but if you're trying to bring a file from Illustrator into Cinema 4D, you just head to Illustrator, File, Save As, just save, and you have to make sure to save it as an Illustrator 8 file. So you'll just do that, hit OK. Then we jump back into Cinema. I could go open that up. Let me just shrink this. There we go. Production. This is our converted file. And I should open up, and boom, we have our interface here. Looks great, pretty much what we designed. If I jump back into our Cinema 4D file, you can see that a lot of this stuff is, animated in a nice way. Some of it, for the lines, I animated by hand using sweep. But for a lot of these, like elements, I used a inheritance effector. Right? If I jumped into this fracture object, you can see I'm using inheritance. And the nice thing about the inheritance effector is I don't have to animate these things individually, but I can animate one shape, one object, and have that animation be applied to some of these other objects. So when you see like all these things flashing, that's really just taking the animation from one object and applying it to all the others. So for those who've never really used the inheritance effector, I'll just do like a super quick demo. I'm going to make a cloner. I'm going to put a cube in that cloner, and it's already on linear, so I'm just going to move these in X space, space them out just a tad. I'm going to add some more clones, so we have a nice line here. I am then making sure the cloner is selected, add an inheritance effector. Then I'm just going to duplicate this cube and add some animation to this cube. So we're just going to have it move up in Y space. So add a keyframe, go forward in time, move it up, add another keyframe, bring it back down. Well, actually, I could just duplicate this keyframe to bring it back to its original position. And now we could take the animation I applied here and place it to all the other clones. So via the inheritance, if I drag this cube into the object parameter here, and I set the inheritance mode to animation, and you want to make sure and set this to node. And what that does is that it moves each clone from its individual axis. And then the start and end frames is essentially how much time you want this each clone to animate. So I think maybe 10 seconds would be cool. We could always adjust it. And then you see they all move up and down. Maybe let's just do 15. But now we want a nice little offset. So we'll offset it one frame, and now we get a really cool, nice wavy motion. So that is what the inheritance effector does. It takes the animation from one object and applies it to a bunch of clones, and you can offset it to get some really nice procedural animation. So hopping back into that other file. So we're applying the same idea to the interface, and that's how we're getting that really nice animation. Let me show you guys some of the compositing. So just to discuss this really quickly, compositing was done in Nuke, and it really was just taking this main Cinema 4D layer. I did an additional pass in After Effects of animation, adding some glows, combined everything, and then, you know, we really got this nice look that turned out pretty nice. So next we're going to focus on this this shot, which is honestly one of my favorites, because one, it's that first shot that really kicks off the scene. It's the first time we really see the world, like the wider world versus, you know, seeing what's inside this visor. There's a lot of cool stuff going on, the ground shattering, and it really sets the tone for the rest of the piece. So let's start by discussing this floor shatter a little bit. So that I actually did in Houdini, you know, just using some procedural tools. These are those shattered pieces. So I brought those into Cinema, and this is where I think, again, Cinema shines and MoGraph really shines. This is that exact same shot. I just kind of took out the environment and everything else. And you can see exactly what's happening. So the cool thing about this, as anyone that's seen my past presentations, I'm not a huge fan of dynamics just because I find it a little bit, you know, difficult to art direct and shatter exactly, you know, how you want it to. So, you know, that's why I love using MoGraph. So by just having those pieces in a fracture object, you know, bringing these over from Houdini, I could then take like a random effector with a plane effector. A random effector with a spherical field. And what that's doing is just applying some random rotation to these pieces, right? So as the stormtrooper is falling, scene's a little bit heavy, so sometimes it takes a little time to load. What's happening here is that this spherical field that we're seeing here is just growing from the center, and you can see it right here. It's just growing from the center and adding some randomness, some random rotation to these pieces as, you know, the stormtrooper falls onto the ground. And if you want to see like a preview of that in real time, you know, this is kind of like how it looks. And it's pretty simple. And, you know, my philosophy is always finding the simplicity in the shot. And designing that shot, I knew this is exactly how I was going to do it, and worked out perfectly. So hopping back into the more dense scene, there were two things I wanted to point out. If you go back to the original video, we can see that when the stormtrooper hits the floor, there's some really nice little particle bursts that hit the floor when the stormtrooper does. So what's generating that actually are these X particle sims that I have going on. That's just really adding those subtle touches to help make that shatter feel more realistic. It's all about having those bigger and smaller pieces in there. The other thing I wanted to point out was just scene management. As you can tell, there's a lot of stuff going on. It's a little bit hard to navigate. I can barely play the scene back. But this is why layers really come in handy in Cinema 4D, because then I could just select something like, say, for example, this falling trooper, and I get clean playback, and I can isolate just this guy, and I can animate on him, and everything's good to go. So that's how I animated the scene. I just made sure I had everything in layers so I could uncheck, unselect, and just navigate the scene efficiently. Okay, on to the next. And let's see. So the next shot we're going to take a look at is shot 30, which is apparently a lot of people's favorite shot, which is this internal viewing of a blaster, something we don't typically see. I know we have a bunch of different things happening. We have, like this particle animation happening. There's a lot of detail in the background. As you can see here, there's lasers coming out. And then there's this like ambient particle system kind of moving into the crystal as we zoom out. So we'll just kind of take a look at how we built some of this stuff. So going back. This was the first sim. So this is a particle sim I did in Houdini. I brought it over and comped that into that shot in Nuke. And then here's another sim that I did. That's an ambient thing with a little comp magic that aided in, getting some of that detail in there. So closing that and jumping to Cinema 4D, this is the actual shot. But when we look, there isn't necessarily like a lot of detail in the material itself, in the body itself, I should say. I'm just kind of giving you guys a look at how I built the whole thing. It's essentially just a tube, and as we fly through the different compartments that we flow through. So there's also one other layer that I made with just like a 2D card, and as I play that through, you can see that just animating. So I took those 3 layers of laser activity and comped that together and to get the final look. So how are we getting all that detail in the back that we saw in that other piece? So here's that piece, rendering in Redshift. If we look, we're seeing all this detail in the back, and that's actually being generated by displacement, and that's how we're getting a lot of the detail as I just orbit around the scene. You're going to see, that's all just baked into the texture, which is pretty nice because, we're getting a lot of that detail without necessarily having to add more geometry into the scene, which could really slow things down. And, once you see the render, it just makes it feel like there's so much more happening in the scene. So that's why I always love displacement, especially in Redshift, just because it adds so much extra detail to the scene that you get for free. So going back, if we were to just go back to that folder, we could take a look at that compositing workflow. So this is the render straight from Cinema. And for this scene, I'll pause. I think I had gotten a question at some point as to why I used a depth mat, which I don't usually use. This is the only time I've used it in, I guess, recent memory for me, but I think it was because, one, it just made the render a lot faster, and 2, like, I wanted to make sure I got very clean, depth of field. So when you're using a depth map, especially in Nuke, you're just going to get like a nice clean result, and also like fast render time when it's rendering on the farm. So that was the reasoning behind that. But there's no other place in the film where I actually use a depth map. So this is me like adding in those comp layers that I brought from from Houdini, and putting the final shot together to get, what we have here for the final shot, which I think turned out really, really good. I'll just play that final shot for you again. Yeah. Get all the... So the next shot we'll talk about is a favorite of mine, just because, there's so many things going on, cool fire blast, There's a lot of stormtroopers and characters in the shot. So there was, a lot of things to figure out. Dynamic camera animation. So we're just going to discuss how I approach tackling some of these things. Start off by talking about some of the effects. Again, I just, did a fire sim in Houdini. That was like the initial part of the project that I did. So I did that and I got, let me see, this animation. So this was like one of the base animations for that piece. And then I did 2 particle sims. This one, which has like tens of millions of particles because, as you can tell, like the grain in here is super duper fine. But that's using particle advection based on that other fire pyro sim that I just showed. And here's another simulation where I just tweaked the settings. You can tell there's more wispiness in the flame here versus the other shot that came before it. And then for that other shot at the end, I decided to use X particles, which really came in handy because these are one of the effects I left for last, and yeah, X particles really handled this like a champ. So if you go back to this shot, that's that blast right here, boom. So the other challenge was, and again, like if I go back to that shot, there's a ton of character animations. There's a bunch of dudes in here, and I'm not a character animation, so figuring out how to handle that. So when I did my animatic, what I did is I took the stormtrooper, exported it out as a FBX. I uploaded it to Mixamo, and I downloaded like a bunch of pre-recorded animations. But the problem with that obviously is that those animations started and stopped at different times, so it didn't feel natural. Fortunately, I had a buddy named David Lee, who is a character animator that works in Maya. I passed him along some files, and like a champ, he went in based on those Mixamo animations, reanimated a bunch of that stuff, so it got like a more seamless animation throughout. So what ended up in the final piece was a combination of shots that he animated and shots that I animated. So like all the stuff in the beginning parts, I animated this guy, all the slow motion stuff obviously is easier. And then, all of his really cool Maya animation came in here to save the day. And just, I'll talk about that workflow too. I just exported it from Maya as a limbic, which you'll see when I open the file, and just textured them, placed them in the scene, and everything again rendered like a champ. Okay, let's jump to cinema. This is the scene file. These are the Olympics that I've been talking about. Yeah, it's a pretty heavy scene, just changing windows. And again, I'm implementing that layer system so I could turn on and off things, but just for the sake of showing you guys everything that's in the scene, I'll just leave everything on and just navigate to show you guys what's been happening. So while we're on this shot, I'll just discuss some of the lighting of the scene and how I approach it. So right now I have all the lights turned off. I'll just go ahead and search for the lights. And we're going to start by turning on all the lights in the environment. So this is all the lights I modeled with the scene. So this gives some really good ambient lighting for the environment. It's relatively dark. And then I'll just turn on the lights in the dynamic laser system that I developed. So that's why in the final shot you see stormtroopers dynamically lighting as these lasers fly through, because there's like a little particle system that I built to get that done. So there's that. Then there are these 2 planes that I have here with an emissive flame texture, just to give some really good, let me just enable that, some good color and highlights in there. And then we're going to actually light some of these troopers. So I always like using a rim light to just define the shape, because if I turn this off, you can see that everything is just a little bit flat. There's no gradation in here, and for me it's all about value. That's how you get good lighting. To me, it's about the values in your subject. So I enable a key light, a rim light there, and then I start adding some key lighting, so there's a strong direction for where the light is coming from. And just reinforce that key light, and then some more rim lighting. But again, if you look across all the stormtroopers, you can see nice gradation. There's a part that's clearly lighter and it goes into dark, goes back into light. It feels dynamic. It doesn't feel flat. What makes bad lighting is just flat areas that doesn't have gradation or value. So, that's kind of how I approach things. Always making sure there's a direction where the light is coming from. There's gradation across surfaces. I love to have a key to kind of define the silhouette, and just adding some reds and oranges to bring some. So let's also talk about some of the compositing, and then let's go to that main comp again. This is how we started off, straight from cinema and Redshift. I went back and I add some of the texture and some of the just the grunt and those worn effects. Yep, just adding some lighting back, some atmosphere, and color correct. And then you have your final shot. So quickly, we can also take a look at that blast file. So I'm just going to scrub through here. What you'll see is two things. I'll just disable the particle sim, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, but just explain the thinking behind it. Essentially how you make energy effects, or again, I'm not an FX artist, but based on what I did, it usually comes from advection of particles, and that's usually driven by a particle sim. And what advection means is essentially moving particles using the velocity fields from a fluid sim. So essentially, this will be a fluid sim, and then on top of that, I'm putting a particle sim down. So that flame is moving these particles around. Yeah, it's pretty heavy. So, scrubbing is obviously difficult. But as it's going through, it's moving the particles, and what you get is a really nice organic movement here, which helps to make it feel more like energy. And then when you put that together in the comp, you add a couple layers, and that's why I like to do more than one sim. So say for example, that one I just showed, I'm getting some smaller finite detail, and then this larger one, I'm getting some bigger detail. So when you combine it into the final shot, you get something that feels a little bit more organic. So again, you can see the bigger streaks here, and then you can see the smaller ones here. Some comparable depth of field, some glows. It really helps to bring everything together to make it feel pretty robust. This is a particular scene that I really wanted to pull off, because I wanted to make that initial strike feel super duper impactful. And the fact that we're seeing all these small fragments, things are shattering, and with this glowing light, it feels like something grand is happening. And also, what I'm particularly proud of is pretty much how simple this scene is. So as we jump into cinema, again, this is kind of using techniques I've discussed. That's this shot without the camera. This is with the camera. We see, again, these shards disintegrating and particles spilling up. I'll just do a wider shot so you get a better idea of what's happening behind the scenes here. So all we have, again, is that same torso piece with it fractured. And then, again, similar techniques. We're taking MoGraph. Here again, we have a random effector with rotation turned on, and we're using a spherical field, right? And we're just kind of running this through. But at the same time, as we have this spherical field running through the torso, we have plane effector, which is scaling and moving the pieces a little bit. So that's why like they're moving up slightly as they're going through, and then they're shrinking. And the reason they're shrinking is to let a little bit of light through. And I'll just open up Redshift, and we can get an idea of what that looks like. So we have Redshift on now, and you can see like we have this volumetric light that we're creating using Redshift. And for the time being, I'll just disable these particles. So if we didn't have the shrinker on, we're going to see less of this light shining through, and I'll just use the render region to make sure it renders a little bit faster. So yeah, the whole reason we're shrinking some of these pieces is so that some of this volumetric light can kind of shine through and make everything feel pretty nice. We could just enable that, the particles. And the particles also adds like a really nice touch to it. It really gives that sense of, destruction. If we go back to the final rendered piece, like when we see those little shards come up, it really helps to add like that atmosphere to it. And then we're catching these little glints in the depth of field. It's all those little subtle details that make the shot, feel alive. And this is again where like X Particles, Cinema 4D, and Redshift shine, because if I click on this emitter where I'm emitting these particles, all I'm doing is just taking some of these fragments from this broken up piece here, and I have all the pieces again in a fracture object. And in that fracture object, I just have attached to it these two MoGraph modifiers, this random effector and this plane effector, and that's pretty much all that's happening here. In conjunction with these two emitters that are throwing particles up into the air. I guess one other thing I'll mention too, I'm just giving these particles some random rotation, always making sure to check use rotation and extended data, so you could use MoGraph modifiers with rotation on them, which again is not super complex, but when you look at the shot, you might think is like a simulation or something. But for me, as I always reiterate, it's finding like the simplest way to execute something that still looks pretty nice in my opinion. The next shot after this, and I'll just pull up that Cinema 4D file, which again is something I was epically excited for, because I was like scratching my head, like trying to figure out how I'm going to do this shot. And again, it's using a similar technique, but it's slightly more elaborate. There was a couple, tricks that had to happen, because, if you look here, while, the stormtrooper is shattering, his limbs are moving. He's like flying back, and that kind of provided its own little challenge, because you can't shatter a moving rig. At least, I mean, you can, I'm sure, but I just don't know how. So I had to figure out a way to do that. So this is the setup. Again, very similar setup to what we saw before, but just a little bit more elaborate. What I had to do was kind of break the rig. I had to position the stormtrooper and then break the rig, make it editable, and then separate all the different parts of his body into individual elements I could animate. So let me just turn off everything so you can see what I mean. So the torso is by itself, the helmet's by itself, the legs is by itself. So I'm kind of animating each one of these things like this, so you kind of get that motion. Let me just jump out the camera so you can see what's going on here a little bit better. And then again, it's the same principles of using MoGraph and fracture objects, placing those pieces into the fracture objects, and using MoGraph to really art direct how this thing explodes. And again, this is why I love using MoGraph, just because of how you can art direct the animation, the look and the feel of things exploding. through and you already see stuff happening. The difficulty in this is figuring out the right combination of effectors to use. I often spend a lot of time trying to figure out what works and what doesn't in what order, and MoGraph is very specific as to how they want these things to be ordered. So I mean, that's just another thing to keep in mind during this process. So that's the shot, and I'll just enable these particles because, again, if you go back to this shot, you can see there's so much little detail here, and that's where X particles, you know, they shine. So I'm emitting a bunch of particles here, as we can see, and this really helps to build up the volume in the shot. Makes it feel like a lot more grand. I'll just go to the second view, and they're all exploding outwards. And you know, if I were to click on these again, I'm just instancing fractured objects using Redshift. Super duper fast, super duper efficient to render, and this whole process was really good. It's really great, easy to use. For that second shot, it's essentially just a different camera angle, looking at the same animation. So, you know, as to just further the action. Just to play back this through again, get a look at how it all turned out. And we could take a look at the compositing workflow. So this, again, the render straight out of Cinema. And again, is just knowing how far to take it and where you could push it in comp. So I'm usually just rendering out a frame, messing around with it in comp before I even do a final render, just to know like if I've gone far enough in Cinema where I could get it to how I want it to look in comp, or do I need to go further? So I'm always kind of jumping between Nuke and Cinema 4D to figure out how much is enough in 3D. And again, you could just do a lot with some color correct, some tweaks in comp, and you get the look that you want. The next scene we're going to be taking a look at, which is the last scene that we're looking at here, is this super dynamic explosion shot that happens at the end. And best believe this shot definitely gave me a headache because it was a lot. Particularly this section here was just insane to deal with, and I'll explain why. So just jumping into the file here. If we take a look at this explosion, this is again something I generated in Houdini, and between this and the two particle sims that accompanied it, it took maybe like at least 100 gigabytes or something more. I don't know, it's just a lot to handle. And then for some strange reason, some of the cache was giving problems at some points, and I could only render certain parts of it, and it was a little bit of a nightmare to deal with, to be honest. But thankfully, you know, I figured out something and I got it to render miraculously. This is the render that came out, and this is a combination of particles, pyro, and yeah, just, you know, stuff mixed in. I just wanted something that looked crazy and dynamic. So if we go back to that shot, one thing that is also very prevalent is the camera motion. It's very dynamic. We're going from very close close-ups to wide shots to moving all across the room to rotating around different stormtroopers, and a lot is going on. So let's just jump into Cinema and take a look at how we're recreating this. So again, we're seeing that camera motion, a lot going on. We're moving a lot around the room, and it looks like one camera motion, but what's actually happening is we're stitching together about 4 or 5 different cameras to get this one seamless move. So if we started on the first motion that happens, the first thing I want to point out is when I'm animating a camera, I typically have that camera nested in a null. And the reason I'm doing this is because the null serves as the focal point. And from there, I can have that camera rotate around that one area. So usually when I'm animating cameras, the null serves as the object I use for rotation and position, making sure that camera is always focused around the center point of that null. So that's typically how I approach it. And the reason I do this is so I can always focus on that one area and always have, again, the rotation around that point for the most part. So the next question is, how are we stitching together these cameras? Well, the trick is, it's like a relay in that sense, right? You want to line up the cameras at one point, and when they line up, I'm using a stage object and I'm just animating between the two cameras. So the other camera picks up where the other one left off. So and you'll see as I play through, it's going back here. And then as it's passing through here, because it's such a fast motion, I'm just quickly switching between these cameras. And again, it's the same thing that happens here. And now the reason I decided to switch between cameras instead of just doing one big camera is because as the camera pans around each one of these stormtroopers, it's a different rotating axis, right? So if I click on this null, you can see that the blue camera here is rotating around, let me just bring back this camera, is rotating around this stormtrooper. But then when we transition to the yellow camera here, and we'll just scroll down, it's rotating around this stormtrooper. So the whole reason I'm transitioning is because each one of these cameras have a different rotating point. And again, once you get to that red camera, it's rotating around a different stormtrooper. So for me, this was a lot easier than just taking that one null and one camera and continuously moving the axis of that null to each one of these stormtroopers, because then the transition could look really messy and untidy sometimes. But also, if I felt like I couldn't line up a particular shot in regards to that transition, when those two cameras would transition, I would also just use a morph object. And I think I did that between the fourth and the sixth camera to get a more smooth transition between the two. So that's essentially the technique I'm using to create this this seamless motion. And again, it is important to use nulls. I use nulls all the time. It's a really good technique in regards to getting nice flexibility in the camera moves that you can do. So it seems like I've come to the end of my presentation. I want to give a special shout out to Echoic. They did an amazing job with the sound design. This film would not be what it is if it weren't for them. Preston Gibson for helping me out with the rigging. He literally was a lifesaver. And just to anyone who contributed to this film would not be possible without the people that contributed. I also want to thank Maxon for allowing me the chance to speak and pass on my knowledge to you guys. It's always a pleasure for me, and it's something I do enjoy. On screen right now, you should be seeing my contacts. If you have any questions, hit me up, visit my website, and follow me on Instagram. All right. Thanks again to you guys. Thanks again to Maxon, and peace.